My parents didn't come to my wedding. Not because they were sick. Not because they couldn't afford the flight. They stayed home on purpose because my husband wore work boots instead of a suit to our first dinner. Red heart, if this story already has your attention, please hit that subscribe button right now, give this video a like, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. It means more than you know, and trust me, this story is only getting started. My name is Brianna. Brianna Calloway. And if you had met me at 25, you would have seen a woman who had checked every single box her parents had ever drawn up for her life. College degree, check. Respectable office job at a marketing firm downtown, check. A clean apartment in a decent part of the city, regular Sunday dinners with the family, the right kind of friends, the right kind of clothes, the right kind of everything. From the outside, my life looked like a perfectly ironed shirt. Neat. Presentable. Exactly what my father, Gerald Calloway, would point to when he talked about the family he'd built. I was his proof of concept. His walking advertisement. The daughter who did it right. My father was a regional operations manager at a mid-size logistics company. He wore the same style of dress shirt every single day, tucked, pressed, collar button fastened. He drove a silver Lexus he'd leased for the optics, not the love of it. He talked about other people's careers the way some people talk about the weather, constantly, casually, and as a measure of everything. When he met someone new, the first question was always, "So what do you do?" Not out of genuine curiosity. Out of calculation. He was sizing them up, filing them into his mental hierarchy before the handshake was even done. Growing up, I thought that was just how adults worked. Took me years to realize it was just how he worked. My mother, Diane, was softer on the surface but no less invested in appearances. She was the kind of woman who kept the living room furniture covered in plastic until guests came over, who sent Christmas cards every year with a family photo where everyone had to wear coordinating colors. She loved me, I genuinely believe that, but her love had conditions attached to it that she never said out loud. It was a love that came bundled with expectations, and when you didn't meet those expectations, the love didn't disappear exactly. Just went quiet. Diane's silence was its own kind of punishment. Then there was my sister Kylie. 2 years younger than me, and somehow my parents' favorite in that subtle way that families never admit to but everyone inside the house can feel. Kylie was sharper with her words than either of our parents. Where Dad was dismissive and Mom was cold, Kylie was the one who would actually look you in the eye and say the cruel thing with a little smile, as if cruelty packaged in a smile somehow made it acceptable. She had this gift for planting insecurities in you and then walking away before you even realized what she'd done. I loved her because she was my sister. But I had spent most of my life feeling like I was one wrong step away from becoming the subject of her next comment. I met Marcus on a Tuesday morning in October. I was running late to work, juggling a tote bag, a half-eaten granola bar, and a to-go cup of coffee I hadn't had time to actually drink. I walked into the coffee shop 2 blocks from my office, and the line was ridiculous. Every commuter in the city had apparently decided to stop there that morning. I was fidgeting, checking my phone, doing that anxious bounce on my heels that I do when I'm stressed, when the guy in front of me turned around and handed me a sleeve for my cup. I hadn't even asked. He'd just noticed my fingers were red from the heat and done something about it without making it a whole thing. That was Marcus Webb in a nutshell. He noticed things. Not in a showy way, in a quiet, practical, deeply human way. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with calloused hands and a kind face. He wore a gray long-sleeve shirt that had a small paint scuff near the cuff, and his boots were the kind you wear when you're going somewhere to actually work. We got to talking in that line, and by the time we both had our coffees, we'd covered everything from the best breakfast tacos in the city to whether remote work had actually made people happier or just made them lonelier. He was sharp. Funny without trying too hard. Kind of person who listens to you like what you're saying genuinely matters, not like he's waiting for his turn to talk. He asked for my number before I walked out. I gave it to him. Simple as that. For the first few months, Marcus and I existed in our own little world, and it was good, genuinely uncomplicated good. He worked in construction, had been doing it since he was 19. He was a project lead for a mid-size contracting crew, and he talked about the work with a kind of honest pride that I found completely refreshing. He wasn't trying to be anything other than what he was. He had plans, big ones, and he talked about them in specific practical terms. Not the vague, I want to be rich someday talk I'd heard from other men. Marcus had a binder. An actual binder with business plans, contractor license notes, market research on commercial construction contracts in our region. He'd been building towards something for years, quietly, without anyone making a fuss over it. I respected that more than I could explain at the time. I want to be fair to Marcus in the telling of this story because it would be easy and dishonest to make him a symbol rather than a person. He was not a perfect man. He was stubborn in the particular way of people who are used to solving everything themselves, and there were arguments in those early years, real ones, about communication and space and what it means to be a partner rather than two people simply living in proximity to each other. We had to learn each other the hard way, the way all people who actually commit to each other eventually do. But what I can say with complete certainty is that he was never anything less than honest with me. And in a life where I had been learning slowly, painfully, that the people closest to you are not always honest, that honesty was the most valuable thing he could have offered. By the time spring came around, I knew I was in love with him. Not the breathless, dizzy kind of love that burns fast and leaves nothing behind. Kind that settles into your bones and makes you feel steadier than you were before. Kind that makes you think, oh, this is what it's supposed to feel like. I told my mother about him before I brought him home. I sat across from her at the kitchen table one Sunday, warming my hands around a mug of tea, and I told her about Marcus. I told her he was kind, thoughtful, that he made me laugh, that he was the most grounded person I'd ever known. She asked what he did. I told her. And I watched her face do the thing, that slight tightening around the eyes, the small shift in posture that meant she was recalibrating. She didn't say anything bad. She said, well, that's nice, Brie. Invite him to dinner sometime. But the warmth had gone out of her voice like someone had turned a dial. I should have known then. I told myself I was overthinking it. The dinner was in May. Marcus showed up with flowers, dahlias, because I'd once mentioned offhand that they were my favorite and he'd remembered. He wore a button-down shirt, clean dark jeans, and yes, his good boots, because that's what Marcus owned, and he was not the kind of man to pretend to be someone else for an audience. He was warm, respectful, and genuinely tried to connect with my family. He asked my father about his work with real curiosity. He helped my mother carry dishes from the kitchen without being asked. He made Kylie laugh twice, which I privately considered a miracle. But my father had made up his mind before Marcus walked through the door. I could see it in the way he shook his hand, firm, brief, assessing, like he was already calculating a verdict. Throughout dinner, he asked Marcus exactly 2 questions. The rest of the time he spoke around him, talked to me as if Marcus weren't sitting right there, and at one point referred to the construction industry as honest work for people who didn't have many other options. He said it pleasantly, the way you might comment on the weather. Marcus nodded and said, "It suits me fine, sir." He didn't flinch. I was the one who felt the sting on his behalf. Kylie was quieter than usual during dinner, which I later understood meant she was absorbing everything for later use. On my way out that night, she caught me in the hallway and said, "He's cute, Brie. Just make sure you know what you're getting into." The little smile was there. I told myself she meant nothing by it. I was wrong about that too. The months that followed were a slow erosion. My parents never said outright that they disapproved of Marcus. They were too sophisticated for that, or at least they believed they were. Instead, it was 100 small things. My mother would call and spend 45 minutes talking about everything except Marcus, then ask at the end, "So how are things with that guy you're seeing?" That guy. After 8 months of a relationship she'd been fully informed about. My father started sending me job listings in other cities, quietly with no note attached, just a link in a text. As if the solution to my choices was a geographical reset. When Marcus came up in family conversations, it was always framed as a phase, a detour, something Brianna was going through before she got back on track. When Marcus proposed to me in November, sitting across from me at the little Italian place where we'd had our first real date, I said yes before he finished the sentence. He'd made the ring himself, not literally, but he'd designed it with a jeweler, a simple band with a small oval diamond, and he'd thought about what I would actually want rather than what looked impressive. I loved it. I loved him. I was not going to let anyone talk me out of that. Telling my parents was one of the hardest conversations of my life. Not because they screamed or threw things. My father didn't operate that way. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, folded his hands on the surface, and said in a very even voice, "Brianna, you are a smart young woman. I have to believe you understand what this choice means for your future." I told him it meant I was marrying someone I loved. He said, "Love doesn't build a retirement account." My mother sat beside him and said nothing at all. That silence was its own sentence. A long, loaded one. I told them the date. I told them the venue, a small botanical garden venue, nothing extravagant, just beautiful and intimate in the way Marcus and I both wanted. I told them everything they needed to know to be there. And then I went home and cried for 2 hours, not because I doubted my decision, but because I was starting to understand what it was going to cost me. The week before the wedding, my mother called. I thought, for one stupid, hopeful second, that she was calling to say they'd be there. She called to say my father had an important work commitment that weekend and they wouldn't be able to make it. I sat on my couch holding my phone, the words landing like stones in still water. No apology beyond the surface. No emotion in her voice. Just the announcement, delivered like she was canceling a dentist appointment. I asked her very quietly if she understood what she was doing. She said, "Brianna, this is a difficult situation for all of us." I said, "It doesn't have to be." She said she hoped I had a lovely day. And she hung up. Kylie sent a text that same night. It said, "Sorry I can't make it either, sis. Scheduling conflict. You know how it is. No explanation. No phone call. Text. After 23 years of being my sister. Our wedding day was the 14th of March. It was cold and bright, the kind of winter morning where the sky is so blue it almost hurts to look at. I got ready in a hotel room with my two best friends, Camille and Nadia, who were furious on my behalf and trying very hard to hide it for my sake. When it came time to put on my veil, I did it myself, standing in front of the mirror. My mother should have been there. That's not a dramatic statement, it's just a fact. That was her moment and she gave it up. I looked at myself in that mirror for a long time. I told myself I was enough. That this day was real and good regardless of who wasn't in it. I fixed the veil straight. I walked out of that room with my chin up. Marcus was standing at the end of that aisle with tears in his eyes that he didn't bother to hide. His mother was there. His uncle and 2 cousins. Our friends. It was a small room, but it was full of people who actually wanted to be there, and somehow that made it feel bigger than any grand ballroom could have. When I reached him, he took both my hands in his and said, quietly enough that only I could hear, "You're the bravest person I've ever met." I didn't completely hold it together after that, but nobody seemed to mind. Cruelest part didn't come until 2 weeks later, when my parents hosted a family brunch, my aunt, my cousins, family friends, and didn't invite us. Not a mistake, not an oversight. A deliberate exclusion. My cousin Maya texted me a photo from the table, not knowing I hadn't been told about it, and asked why I wasn't there. I stared at that photo for a long time. My parents. My sister. Extended family. All gathered around the table where I had eaten every Sunday for most of my life. And I wasn't there because I had married the wrong kind of man. Shortly after that, I noticed I'd been removed from the family group chat. I found out by accident, the way you find out about these things, reaching for something that should be there and finding empty space instead. No conversation about it. No explanation offered. Just the quiet, methodical erasure of me from the daily fabric of my family's life. I was still their daughter on paper. But in practice, I had been filed away. Set aside. Deemed inconvenient. Sounds dramatic when I lay it out like that. But living it didn't feel dramatic. Felt like slow bleeding. Kind where you don't realize how much you've lost until you're suddenly dizzy from it. I kept going to work. I kept making dinner. I kept laughing at things with Marcus and being grateful for our apartment and our little life together. But underneath all of that was a grief I didn't have a clean name for. Not quite mourning, not quite anger. Just this hollow ache of being unwanted by the people who were supposed to want you no matter what. There is something nobody tells you about being cut off by your own family. Not the dramatic screaming kind of cut off, but the quiet administrative kind where you are simply no longer included in the daily life of the people who raised you. Nobody tells you that the silence is the loudest part. That you will be going about your ordinary Tuesday, making coffee, answering emails, folding laundry, and the thought will arrive completely unprompted. My parents didn't come to my wedding. And even months later, even after you've processed it 100 times in your mind, it still lands with a particular freshness, like a bruise you keep forgetting is there until you press it by accident. I lived in that bruise for a long time. Not constantly, not to the point where it defined every day, but it was there underneath everything, and I had to learn to carry it without letting it stop me. That is a different skill than healing. It is the skill of moving forward before you are finished hurting, which is sometimes the only option left. Marcus knew. He wasn't naive about what my family's absence was doing to me. He never told me to get over it or that I was better off without them. He also never once said, "I told you so," which he could have because I'd reassured him before that dinner that my parents would come around. What he did was simpler and more useful than all of that. He showed up every single day in every small way a person can show up for someone they love. He cooked when I was too tired. He sat beside me on the couch without talking when I needed quiet. He built things. He was always building something with his hands, even at home, fixing, improving, making, and somewhere in watching him do that, I began to understand something important about the difference between people who talk about what they're worth and people who just go out and prove it quietly one day at a time. He had incorporated Webb Construction LLC the year before we met. The time it was mostly residential work, renovations, additions, a kitchen remodel here, a deck there. Good, solid work that paid well but didn't yet add up to anything that would make my father revise his opinion. But Marcus was playing a longer game than anyone around him realized. He was reinvesting almost everything he made back into the business. Better equipment, better crew, his contractor's license, then additional certifications in commercial construction management. He spent his evenings studying bid structures and project management frameworks. He was not doing this casually. He was doing this the way a person does something when it's the thing they were built for, and they've decided to honor that fully. I was working my marketing job, good steady pay, decent enough, and I'd started freelancing on the side, brand strategy consulting for small businesses because I was good at it and because we needed to build our own cushion without any safety net from either of our families. We didn't go on fancy vacations that first year. We didn't buy anything we couldn't afford. We cooked at home, drove used cars, said no to things that would have been nice but weren't necessary. People who haven't done that kind of living, that deliberate, purposeful tightening of the belt towards something you believe in, don't always understand what it builds in you. Not just in your bank account, in your spine, in your sense of what you're actually capable of. Christmas of that first year, I called my mother. I wasn't sure she'd answer. She did, but only after several rings, and the conversation was so carefully surface level it felt like talking to a polite stranger. She asked if I was well. I said I was. She did not ask about Marcus. I did not volunteer information about him. We talked for 11 minutes and then said goodbye. I hung up and sat at our kitchen table with my hands flat on the surface, and I thought about what it felt like to be a daughter whose mother talked to her like a distant acquaintance. And then I got up and helped Marcus finish hanging the lights we'd strung up around our living room window, and I let that warmth be enough for that night. The incident that finally, fully cut the rope happened the following spring. It was at my Aunt Carol's birthday party. A family gathering I'd been invited to, one of the few, probably because Aunt Carol had always liked me and had enough spine to override whatever silent directive my parents had put out. I went alone. Marcus had a job site issue that came up last minute, and I walked in hoping for neutral ground for a few hours of normal. About an hour in, my father's colleague and close friend, a man named Doug, had had enough wine to lose his filter. He was talking to a small group loudly enough that the conversation carried, and he said something about how it was a shame some people just didn't know how to marry well. He glanced at me when he said it. He didn't look away. And my father, standing right there with a drink in his hand, said nothing. Did not correct him. Did not look uncomfortable. He took a sip and changed the subject. My mother, 3 feet away, was very interested in her napkin at that moment. Then Kylie, my sister, my blood, said with the smile she reserves for cruelty, "Well, when you romanticize the idea of love over practicality, you get what you get." She wasn't looking at me. She was talking to the group. But every single person in that circle knew exactly who she meant. I was standing right there. I was her sister. And she said that like I was furniture. I put down my glass. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I said very clearly, "I'm going to head out." And I walked out of that party with my head completely straight and my hands barely shaking, got into my car, drove around the block twice so nobody would see me fall apart, and then let myself fall apart alone where it was no one else's business. I drove home. I told Marcus what happened. He pulled me into a hug and held on for a long time without saying a single word. That was the night I stopped waiting for my family to come around. Not bitterly. Not with hatred. Just finally, quietly, with the clarity that comes when you stop fighting a tide and start swimming parallel to the shore instead. The next 18 months were the hardest and the best of my life at the same time, which is a combination nobody warns you about. Webb Construction started bidding on commercial work, office interiors, a small retail development, a medical office renovation. Marcus landed a contract for a warehouse expansion for a regional distribution company, the biggest job he'd taken on at that point. It required him to take on 2 more crew members, upgrade equipment, and manage a 12-week timeline with precision. He did all of it. Every morning before 6, every evening after 8. I hardly saw him some weeks, but I knew exactly what we were building, and so did he. My freelance business had grown into something I hadn't quite expected. Word of mouth is a powerful thing when you're good at what you do, and I had thrown everything I had into being exceptional at what I did. I had 7 regular clients by month 18, including a regional restaurant group and a tech startup that had found me through a blog post I'd written on brand repositioning. I wasn't wealthy, but I was independent in a way that felt completely different from a salary, like I had built something that was mine that no layoff or manager or external validation could take away from me. That feeling is hard to describe to someone who hasn't earned it. It is a quiet, bedrock confidence that changes the way you carry yourself. Marcus landed the contract that changed everything in the fall of what would have been our 2nd anniversary year. A commercial real estate development group was building a mixed-use property, retail, apartments, offices, in a suburb that was booming with new investment. The lead contractor had fallen through at the last minute. Marcus had submitted a bid 3 weeks earlier and it had been sitting in their queue. They called him on a Thursday morning. I was in the kitchen when I heard him on the phone in the other room go completely quiet, then say very steadily, "Yes, sir. We can absolutely handle that. I'll have the updated proposal to you by end of business Friday." He came into the kitchen and sat down at the table and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. Not excitement exactly, more like a man who had been walking uphill for a very long time and just crested the ridge and could finally see the whole valley below. "It's a $2.1 million contract," he said. I sat down across from him. We looked at each other for a moment. Then I reached across the table and took his hand and said, "I know. I always knew." He laughed. It was the kind of laugh that comes out when relief and joy and pride all arrive at the same time and the body doesn't know what else to do with it. That night we ordered from the good Italian place we hadn't been to in over a year, and we ate at our kitchen table and toasted with the decent bottle of wine we'd been saving for exactly this kind of moment. We didn't call anyone. We just sat with it, this thing we had built, this life that was entirely ours, and it tasted better than anything I could have imagined back when I was 25 and checking all my father's boxes. Webb Construction completed that contract on time and $11,000 under budget. The development group referred them to 2 other projects. By the end of that fiscal year, Marcus had a crew of 14, a project manager on staff, and a business valued at just over $2 million by his accountant's conservative estimate. He was 29 years old. He drove a truck, still practical, still Marcus, but he owned it outright. We bought a house, a real one with a yard and a porch and rooms we could actually use. I stood in the empty kitchen of that house the day we got the keys and thought about the version of me that had stood in a hotel mirror fixing her own veil, telling herself she was enough. I wanted to go back and tell her, more than enough. So much more than you know. I had almost stopped thinking about my parents on a daily basis by then. That sounds colder than it was. It wasn't indifference, it was distance, earned and necessary. I thought about my mother sometimes in small moments that surprised me. When I found a recipe she used to make. When it rained and I remembered how she used to make hot chocolate on rainy Sundays. There was grief in those moments, and I let myself feel it without drowning in it. I had built a life so full that the hollow space my family had left was no longer the defining feature of my landscape. It was just one corner of it. Quiet, sad corner I had learned to walk past without being stopped by it. Then, on a Wednesday afternoon in February, my phone rang. It was my mother's number. I stared at it for 3 full rings. We had exchanged occasional texts over the years. Holidays, birthdays, surface-level pleasantries, but she hadn't called me in almost 2 years. I answered. She sounded different. Thinner somehow, her voice. Like something had gone out of it. She asked how I was. I said I was well. She said that was good, that she was glad. Then she said very quietly, "Bree, your father lost his job." I sat with that for a second. Gerald Calloway, the man who had never missed a day of work in his professional life, who had equated career with worth so thoroughly that the two were inseparable in his mind, had been laid off. The logistics company had restructured, eliminated an entire tier of management. He had been one of 14 managers let go in the same week. My mother said it had happened 6 weeks ago. I asked why she was telling me now, 6 weeks later. She didn't really answer that. She said he'd been struggling, that it had been hard on him. I said I was sorry to hear it, and I meant it because I am not the kind of person who celebrates someone else's pain, even when that someone has caused me plenty of their own. Then she said the second thing. She said Kylie's husband had left. Their marriage had lasted 14 months. He'd gone, and he'd left behind a lease they couldn't afford, a loan, and a credit card debt that was Kylie's problem now. My mother said Kylie was devastated. That she was back living at home. I said I was sorry about that too. Then came the third thing, the one that changed the entire texture of the conversation. My mother said her doctor had found something. A mass. Nothing confirmed yet but requiring surgery, and the specialist was out of network, and the insurance coverage had gaps that my father's new job search hadn't yet filled because he didn't have a new job yet, and the bills were. She stopped there, her voice catching just slightly, and I understood that my mother had called me not just to update me on the family's misfortunes but because she needed something. I sat very still. I did not rush in to fill the silence. She said, "We're in a bit of a difficult spot right now." I said, "I understand." She said, "Your father, he wanted me to call. He didn't want to ask himself, but he thought maybe." I said, "Tell him to call me himself." There was a pause. Then she said, "Okay." And we hung up. My father called 2 days later. I was in my home office when the phone rang, and seeing his name on the screen was one of the stranger experiences of my adult life. Gerald Calloway. Dad. The man who had sat across from me at a kitchen table and told me love didn't build a retirement account. The man who had stood at a party while his colleague mocked my marriage and said nothing. I let it ring twice. Then I answered. He sounded older. I hadn't expected that. Not frail, my father would never allow himself to sound frail, but older. The particular kind of older that comes not from years but from a reversal of fortune. He asked how I was doing. I said I was well. He said that was good. Then, without the smooth professional composure I'd watched him maintain my entire life, he said, "Your mother tells me things are going well for you and Marcus." And there it was, Marcus's name in my father's mouth, spoken without the particular flatness he used to deploy when the name came up. Just spoken. Like a regular word. I said, "Yes, they are." He said, "Good. That's good." A pause. "Brianna, I'll be straight with you. We're in a tight spot. Your mother needs this surgery and the coverage isn't what we thought it was, and I'm between positions right now. I'm not asking for," he paused again, recalibrating in real time. "I'm asking if you would be willing to talk." I said, "I'm willing to talk. But I need to do it in person. All of us, you, Mom, Kylie. Come to our house." Pause on his end was long enough that I wondered if he'd agree. Then he said, "All right." I told Marcus that evening. He listened, leaning against the kitchen counter with his arms crossed, not with anger but with that quiet watchfulness he has. When I finished he said, "What do you want to do? Not what do you think we should do. What do you want?" I thought about it for a long moment. I said, "I want to help my mother. And I want everyone in that room to be honest about what happened. Not a fight. Just the truth out loud where it can't be taken back." He nodded. He said, "I'll make dinner." That was Marcus. He made dinner. They came on a Saturday. My father. My mother. Kylie. I watched them pull into our driveway from the living room window, Gerald stepping out of my mother's car. He'd surrendered the Lexus months ago. She'd told me that without saying she was telling me, looking at our house with an expression I couldn't read from a distance. My mother in her good coat, walking carefully up the path. Kylie a few steps behind, looking smaller than I remembered, the usual armor of her confidence visibly thinner. I opened the door before they knocked. I said, "Come in." Not warmly, not coldly. Just plainly. The way you speak when you've decided that dignity is the temperature of the room. Marcus came out from the kitchen to greet them. He shook my father's hand. My father shook his hand back, and this time it wasn't brief and assessing. It was held just a moment longer, the way a handshake is when one person is communicating something through it. My mother said hello to Marcus with a softness in her voice that I had never heard her use with him before. Kylie looked at her shoes and said hi. We sat in the living room. Marcus brought out coffee and the food he'd been preparing, then quietly excused himself to give us space. He did not have to be told to do that. He just knew. I let the silence sit for a moment before I spoke. I've noticed that people who are uncomfortable with silence will rush to fill it, and when people fill silence under pressure, they're usually more honest than they mean to be. So I waited. And my father, true to form, went first. He said, "Brianna, I want to say something." I said, "Okay." He looked at his hands for a second and then looked up at me and said, "I was wrong about Marcus. I judged him before I knew him, and I was wrong." He said it clearly, without hedging, which surprised me. I nodded. I said, "I know you were." My mother said, "We both were." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "We should have been at your wedding." That was, she stopped, her jaw working like she was fighting something. "That was unforgivable of us." "I know that." I watched her face and I saw something I hadn't seen in a very long time, my mother without her composure intact. Just a woman sitting in her daughter's living room, looking at the gap between them and finally acknowledging how wide it was and how she'd helped dig it. I felt something move in my chest. Not forgiveness exactly, that's a slower thing and it had to be, but something softened. A small thaw. Then I looked at Kylie. She was sitting with her hands in her lap, not her usual posture at all. She said, "I was a real jerk to you, Brie. 4 years. And I think I knew I was doing it and I did it anyway because She stopped, looked at the ceiling briefly, because Dad thought a certain way and it was just easier to go along with it. That's not an excuse. I'm just saying why. I studied her face. The smile she used for cruelty wasn't anywhere in it. Just a young woman who'd had a rough year and apparently done some thinking in it. I said, I know, Kylie. I said it without harshness. I didn't pile on. What she'd offered was more than I'd expected, and I chose to receive it as the beginning of something rather than the settling of a debt. Then I spoke. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't deliver a speech I'd rehearsed or a list of grievances I'd catalogued. I just told the truth in the same tone I might use to describe something that had happened to someone else, calmly, clearly, without performance. I said, you removing yourselves from my wedding was one of the most painful things that has ever happened to me. Not because I needed your approval, but because I needed my family, and you decided your opinions about my husband mattered more than your daughter. That's what happened. I want us all to be clear about that. Nobody spoke. I went on. I have spent years wondering what I could have done differently, and the answer is nothing. I made a good choice. I married a good man. And he has built something remarkable, not because he needs to prove anything to anyone in this room, but because that's who he is. I need you to understand that. My father said very quietly, I understand that. I said, good. A pause. Mom needs her surgery. That's not a question, she's going to get it. Marcus and I have already discussed covering the specialist cost. I watched my father's face process that. The pride and the relief and the complicated weight of being helped by the son-in-law he'd dismissed doing a visible battle in his expression. I continued, but I'm not writing a check so that we can go back to the way things were. That's not on the table. If you want a relationship with me, a real one, it starts from here. From honesty. From treating Marcus with the respect he has more than earned. And from acting like I'm your daughter, not your embarrassment. If those things are possible, then I'm here. I looked at each of them in turn. Are those things possible? My mother said yes first. Then my father. Then Kylie, who looked like she might cry and was fighting it with everything she had. I nodded. I said, then let's have dinner. And I got up and went to find Marcus in the kitchen. He was at the stove, stirring something that smelled incredible, earbuds in, apparently completely unbothered. I came up behind him and put my arms around him and my chin on his shoulder. He took one earbud out and said, how'd it go? I said, good. I think it went good. He turned around and looked at my face with that quiet attentiveness he always has and said, yeah, looks like it. He kissed my forehead and turned back to the stove. I stood there for a moment in our kitchen in our house, listening to the sounds from the living room where my family was sitting, and I let myself feel the full weight of that moment, not the pain which had been real and long, but this which was also real. The return. The renegotiated table. Possibility of something repaired, not to its original shape, but to something sturdier and more honest. My mother's surgery was scheduled for the following month. It went well. The mass was benign. We found that out 2 days post-op, in a hospital waiting room where my father sat beside me for 2 hours without speaking much, and where I understood that grief is a great equalizer. When the doctor came out with good news, my father's composure broke, just for a second, and he put his face in his hands. I put my hand on his shoulder. Not because everything was resolved or forgiven or settled, but because he was my father and his wife was going to be okay, and some moments are not about the past. The days after that dinner had a different texture than the ones before it. Something had been named that had spent years being unnamed, and the air was cleaner for it. Not all the way healed, not uncomplicated, but honest, and honesty was the foundation that everything else would have to be built on if anything real was going to grow. I was under no illusion that a single conversation fixed 3 years of deliberate exclusion. But I was also not the kind of person who needed everything resolved in one afternoon in order to move forward. I knew what rebuilding looked like. I had been doing it for years. My father found a new position 4 months later, A smaller company, lower title, significantly reduced salary, but a position nonetheless. He never said out loud that the experience had changed him. But I noticed things. He stopped asking about salaries when he met new people at dinners we began having more regularly. He stopped referencing careers as the first metric of a person's worth, at least in my presence. He asked Marcus one evening, genuinely with his whole attention, about how he'd grown the business, about the commercial contracting market, about what challenges he navigated. Marcus answered him with the same generosity he extends to everyone, and I watched my father listening with the specific expression of a man recalibrating something deep and long held. It wasn't transformation. It was the beginning of one. That was enough for me. Kylie and I are not what we were when we were kids. That closeness, if it was ever fully real, has been remade into something more careful and more honest. She calls me now. Not always, not constantly, but she calls. She asks about my life with actual curiosity. She talks about her own with actual vulnerability, which is something I never saw in her before. Her marriage ending was devastating for her, and the aftermath. The financial scramble, the living back at home, the stripping away of the life she'd curated, did what hard things sometimes do when we don't run from them. It made her more real, more human. I find I like this version of my sister considerably more than the one I grew up with, and I've told her so, which made her laugh and then go quiet in the way that means something landed. Marcus expanded the business again the following year, opened a second operational office, took on a senior project manager and a dedicated estimator, and by the end of that fiscal year had crossed the $2.5 million mark in company valuation. He doesn't talk about the money much. He talks about the work, the specific satisfactions of a project completed well, a crew that functions like a well-oiled machine, a client who calls back with a referral because the trust was earned. He bought himself one nice thing with all of it, a really excellent set of custom work boots, handmade, the kind that last 20 years if you take care of them. I teased him about that. He said some things are worth doing right. That's Marcus. That will always be Marcus. I think about that version of me at 25 sometimes, the one with the checklist, the one who thought the shape of a life was determined by the right credentials in the right order. I think about her standing in that hotel room mirror fixing her own veil, and I feel such tenderness for her. She didn't know yet what she was capable of. She hadn't yet discovered that the things taken from you, the approval, the inclusion, the warmth of people who should have given it freely, can become, if you let them, the very ground your strength grows from. She hadn't yet learned that being underestimated is only a disadvantage if you believe the estimate. I think about the version of me at 25 sometimes, the one with the checklist, the one who thought the shape of a life was determined by the right credentials in the right order, accumulated in the right sequence, presented to the right audience. I think about her going to Sunday dinners and laughing at her father's jokes and wondering, in the quietest part of herself, if the life she was performing was the one she actually wanted. She hadn't yet had someone hand her a cup sleeve in a coffee shop. She hadn't yet discovered that the truest version of your life often begins in the moment you stop auditioning for other people's approval and start building something that is entirely your own. I am 31 now. I run my own brand strategy firm. Not freelance anymore, an actual firm with 2 employees I am extremely proud of and a client list that keeps me genuinely engaged every single day. Marcus and I are talking about starting a family. Our house has a garden that I've been stubbornly and imperfectly tending for 2 years. There is a porch where I drink my coffee on weekend mornings and watch the light come up, and it is, on most mornings, exactly the life I want. My parents came to our housewarming when we first moved in. This was after the dinner, after the surgery, after everything had shifted. My father walked through the house with the careful attention of a man taking something in. When we got to the back porch, he stood for a moment looking out at the yard and said, "This is a good house, Brianna." I said, "We built it well." He knew I wasn't talking about the structure. He nodded slowly and said, "You did." It was not a grand reconciliation speech. It was not the conversation I might have written for him in a dream. But it was true, and it was offered plainly, and for my father that was the most honest he knew how to be. I took it. I'm still deciding day by day what forgiveness looks like at full scale, because forgiveness is not a single moment but a practice, a daily choice to release what you're owed and live forward instead. Some days I am better at it than others. But I am working at it, and that is enough. If I could say one thing to the version of you who is watching this and recognizing something in it, maybe your own family's silence, your own experience of being told you're too much or not enough or going the wrong direction, it would be this: the people who underestimate you are not seeing you clearly. They are seeing their own limitations reflected in your choices and calling it a comment on your worth. You are not their verdict. You are not the box they tried to put you in. The most powerful thing you can do is not revenge, not confrontation, not even waiting for them to apologize. The most powerful thing is the life you build while they're busy writing you off. Build it carefully. Build it honestly. Build it like Marcus builds things, with both hands, full attention, and absolute belief in what it will become. That life, built quietly while no one believed in it, will say everything that needs to be said. It will say it calmly, completely, and in a voice that cannot be argued with. Let it speak for you. Let it speak loud. Thank you for being here and listening to my story all the way through. If this resonated with you, if you've ever been dismissed by someone who should have believed in you, if you've ever had to build something real without anyone cheering you on, please leave a comment below. I read every single one. And if you haven't already, please subscribe and give this video a like. It helps more people find stories like this one. I'll see you in the next one.